Before Tank can play for the first time, Cowboy Bebop opens on an urban backdrop, colours muted, a bell tolling in the background. The camera pans down on a city skyline, framed on a slanted diagonal angle, and we find a mysterious man, head tilted to the ground, face obscured, flowers clutched in his hand. Sad. A tone is set instantaneously, and then that fucking song starts playing. A track called Memory, a song that promptly teleports you to exactly where you need to be within its first note. Memory is downloaded on my phone, and I'll find myself sometimes in the shower, playlist on shuffle, only for it to intrude on my peaceful space, and I'll rush to skip it, not wanting to go there, not right now, but Cowboy Bebop forces you to go there immediately. We are confronted with a close-up of the man, face still obscured, as he takes the last puff of his final cigarette before dropping it, giving up. We follow it down and find a pile of them cluttering the ground at his feet. He's been waiting for quite a while, waiting for the person the flowers are for, presumably. The man walks away slowly realizing she isn't coming. Sad. He slowly walks, framed diagonally also, and then comes to a puddle that catches his reflection. A rose from the bouquet of flowers falls lightly into the puddle, and we zoom in gradually. Rain continues to drop, rippling the puddle, while we zoom. Then we begin catching glimpses of the man's past. His memories, a memory coloured in violence and melancholy, then cut back to the slow zoom on the rippling puddle, the rose slowly turning scarlet as we are shown more. A memory, then the rose, ripening red with blood. A memory, then the rose, ripening red with blood, and rinse and repeat, until we get to the last memory, one of the man's death. We see the man release his grasp on a grenade he's holding in his hand, then cut to his face, hanging from the top of the frame, still obscured, bleeding from a smile. Blood runs down his cheek, and then we cut to black. The man went out in a blaze of glory, and is dead. We hold on the silence of the black screen for less than a second before we cut to Tank for the first time. Its loudness, its bombast, juxtaposing everything that came before it. That's how Cowboy Bebop introduces itself in less than a minute. And I think it's perfect. Sad. That really is the Cowboy Bebop formula, isn't it? Bombast plus sadness and the tone that juxtaposition creates. That is Cowboy Bebop. Cool and meaningful, melancholic and poignant. This formula is evident across all the core aspects of the series, I think. Right down to its core character designs of its lead man and leading lady. Spike and Faye's character designs practically jump out at you, and are immediately recognizable to anybody familiar, and probably even those who aren't. But the boldness of their outward appearances is cuttingly contrary to who we know them to be internally. These are sharply regretful individuals, hurting deep down. Don't let Spike's big hair and suave suit fool you, his eyes reflect something else. Don't let the bright yellows of Faye's provocative getup fool you. As cool and sexy as it is, underneath she is a scared woman alone in the world and alone in time. It's bombast and sadness and the beauty that juxtaposition creates. It's built into the very core concept of these characters, their designs, their arcs, their stories, so much so that a mere glance at either of them will confound you. It'll have you reveling in their coolness while also wallowing in their melancholy. A mere glance can carry this much emotional weight. Even outside of these characters individually, the biggest and most memorable moments of the series live in this juxtaposition as well. Think about the bombast of Call Me, but the unrelenting sadness of Faye outlining her old home and Iron and Ed going their own way. Think about Spike's final stand, the bombast of him fighting up the tower and the sadness of his fall. And think about, most importantly for the titular statement of this video, Episode 1 of Cowboy Bebop, and the way the bombast and sadness formula is introduced with Asimov and Katarina, and Spike and Jet's reaction to it. If you somehow hadn't gotten the idea, or had ignored the title, this video is about the importance of Episode 1 of Cowboy Bebop, Session 1, Asteroid Blues, and why I don't think we give it enough credit for being the perfect introduction to the series, and of this bombast plus sadness formula. For the opening of this video, I hope to recreate the feelings of the cold open of the show and demonstrate how it masterfully creates this sad, weighty tone instantaneously before abruptly cutting itself off with the loudness and bombast of Tank playing for the first time. That opening minute or so is itself a microcosm of Cowboy Bebop. It captures those conflicting feelings immediately, effortlessly, with such poise, and this is only elaborated upon throughout the entire first episode, which perfectly lays the groundwork for the formula to be implemented in greater degrees as the show continues and creates the perfect platform for one of the best shows of all time. First impressions are often important, and representative of deeper themes of a work, and Cowboy Bebop does that perfectly in its cold open, but first episodes are also part of that first impression. So let's uncover how this episode continues building on that first impression, and get into why I think it deserves more credit than we sometimes give it for being the perfect introductory episode for Cowboy Bebop. After the cold open and Tank playing for the first time, which we've already gone over in this video, Cowboy Bebop opts to open reserved, with some establishing shots of the sci-fi setting, and then of our current members of the Bebop, those being only Spike and Jet at the time of our series open. Our first glance of Jet is him whipping together some bell peppers and beef with no beef, and our first glance of Spike post-cold open is of him practicing his martial arts. Little do we know, but we are actually seeing the everyday routines of our characters first, rather than getting a more conventional introduction of them doing something exciting. This will be important in how we bookend the episode. They then continue playing out what I presume is their everyday antics as Jet tries to get to work by going over their next bounty, with Spike too grumpy about the lack of beef in his bell peppers and beef to pay any attention, only for Jet to then counter angrily that paying for the damages Spike caused on their last chase is why they can't afford the beef in the first place. And now they're just pissy at each other. This seems like an argument they have all the time. An integral aspect of Cowboy Bebop is introduced here, and no, this time we aren't talking about bombast and sadness. Here it is established that Spike and Jet, despite existing in this wild sci-fi setting and seemingly being wacky, cool, out-of-this-world characters, have everyday problems that they spend most of their time bogged down in. They are struggling with money, often grumpy, and are stuck in a routine that they do every day. This is how they are made relatable to the audience. Spike, despite all he is, and Jet, despite all he is, are still at the mercy of these very mundane, earthly struggles, like all people, like you and I. We then spend most of the episode on Tijuana, following the story of Asimov, our first bounty, and his wife Katarina. At a glance, these two would seem like a promising, handsome young couple, ready to welcome their first child into the world, the very personification of hope. But like most things in Cowboy Bebop, things aren't always as they seem. In truth, these two, mostly Katarina, are desperately clutching onto some semblance of hope as they try to escape their circumstances, entrapped by the Syndicate after stealing lots of product from them in the hope of selling it off to secure passage to Mars. The journey, however, has taken its effect on Asimov, who has to test the product on himself to potential buyers every time to prove its potency. We are positioned throughout the episode to sympathize mostly with Katarina. She is seemingly pregnant, which will naturally mean an inbuilt level of sympathy for her from a general audience, but she also has cute interactions with Spike, isn't violent like her husband who sometimes even lashes out at her, and we even hear her hopes of being safe and happy on Mars as Elm plays in the background. She is the emotional linchpin of the episode. As the story comes into its climax, it's revealed that Katarina is in fact not pregnant and was using the perception that she was to hide their stolen product under her dress without suspicion. This is a very clever visual gag when initially revealed that doubles as an interesting subversion of the hopeful symbolism of pregnancy. Usually pregnancy is symbolic of hope and the future and starting anew, which we know the Katarina story is clearly about. But it's not literally represented by a pregnancy here. Instead, it's representative of her very literal hope, the red eye. The metaphor is bastardized by Cowboy Bebop grit, but it still stands, which I always thought was extremely clever. The thing underneath her clothes attached to her belly is in fact the only thing keeping her hope alive. It's just not what we expect it to be. Eventually, however, as Asimov and Katarina are being chased by Spike and Jet, the criminals they stole from, and are cornered by the authorities, it becomes more and more evident how hopeless this hopeful journey was. And it's particularly tragic for Katarina, who has watched her husband, a man she must have loved once, slowly lose himself to the madness, which of course leads to her shooting him in the head and putting him out of his misery before being blown away herself. Her hope now being a stand-in for blood scattered across the cold vacuum of space. Spike witnesses all this and is taken aback. though this is not the first tragedy he's seen. We then harshly cut away from Spike looking on as all this happens, back to the Bebop, to find ourselves right back to where we started, presumably the following day, with Spike and Jet back in their routines. Jet is cooking again and Spike is practicing his martial arts again, burying all the tragedy he's just seen in his routine. The implication being that in life, these small sad stories are all around us. They are what make us who we are. Our involvement in them and our witnessing of them are what make us who we are. And here Spike is doing what we all do. He chooses to ignore them and hide beneath the covers of his daily routine. Because thinking about it and all the other sad stories after the bombast would tear him apart. No matter what happens, what bombast we may encounter, food needs to be cooked the next day. Our daily routine must go on, and that's life. It's sad, if you think about it for too long you might get lost, but after the bombast, normality wins out, and with that comes a sad aftertaste. Cowboy Bebop is a collection of these small sad stories, of haunting hurtful memories, like Katarina and Asimov's, ultimately culminating in the message that you will carry this weight. Despite trying to forget, the weight lingers with you, slowly changing you. Subconsciously, Spike will remember Asimov and Katarina's story as we will remember his. It is the lasting sadness after the bombast. It's the loud sadness that is Cowboy Bebop. Episode 1 of Cowboy Bebop is a microcosm of the entire lasting point of the series, of being bombastic and sad, of being a loud, sad story that lingers heavily with you as you turn it off and continue with your own daily routine. It's not the best episode in the series, that's why I think it's the perfectly designed place to start. I know some of you looked at the title of this video and were perplexed, hopefully never having heard the discourse about skipping episode 1 of Cowboy Bebop. With the title, I'm referring to the subsection of fans, who I've seen say things like episode 1 isn't that good, and point people to start at episode 5. Which is more immediately impressive, but I think episode 1 being worse than episode 5 is the biggest reason to start with episode 1, so the series has room to grow and to perfect the formula. So gentlemen, please don't skip episode 1 of Cowboy Bebop, and appreciate it for being perfect in the ways it needed to be as an introduction to potentially the greatest anime of all time.